just to warm us all up this morning, let me know what gets in the way. So what stops us having the time to think? What do we think are the big barriers? Always interested to know. If we know the obstacles, we can figure out how to overcome them. Steve, I really like that. A very evocative word. The panic of the day. I really like that. I feel it. Firefighting, troubleshooting, the to-do list. Just slightly different to panic, isn't it? Panic is like, wow, so much to do. I've got no time to think. To-do list is like, I've got too much to be getting on with. And I think that might feel like different emotions. Someone else's needs, yeah. So maybe my time is not my own. Would be a good way of thinking about that. My time is not my own. Mailbox overflow of actions, yeah. Where to start, yeah. So I feel like I'd like more time to think, but where do I start with that? How do I make that happen? Lots of people saying other people's priorities. For those of you who are long-term listeners, you'll remember our episode on managing monkeys. Always a really good one to listen to if you feel like you end up doing other people's work or prioritizing other people's urgent over your own urgent. You get drawn into something, not knowing what to spend time thinking about. Yeah, just being practical, everything feeling urgent. There's that great phrase as well, that sometimes we get stuck in tunnels. So it's described as like tunneling, which is when, when you're in the tunnel, but you can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. And this, I think, is also, you could also describe it as that kind of the hamster wheel effect of where every day you just sort of feel like your head down, you're getting stuff done. You kind of can't see the light above the tunnel. You can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. And that's often when you're in constant troubleshooting, firefighting mode. Depends a bit on your job and your industry. I've worked in lots of different companies, and there have definitely been some companies where that's felt like more of a challenge to navigate than others. Some industries are naturally slower and sometimes a bit more thoughtful and create the conditions where you naturally have more time to think. Other industries less so. So it's also worth thinking, which we didn't really talk about on the podcast this week, about your context. And what does your context, I think, can give you clues about what time to think might look and feel like for you right now. And if you're anything like me, sometimes I get a bit stubborn versus situational. So I'll think, well, this is how I like to think. And this is how it's worked well for me before. But I think it's also really important to spot your situation. So if I compare, say, working at Barclays to working at Sainsbury's, Barclays was naturally quite a different culture. It was slower. It did take longer to make things happen. The pace just gave you more space. It didn't mean you weren't kind of getting things done, but it did mean that you naturally had more time to think. You then go into a Sainsbury's, and Sainsbury's is retail, and retail is operational. It's attention to detail. They will say retail is detail, and people love saying that who work in retail. And it's very day to day because you're selling bananas today, you're selling baked beans today. And so if you're thinking, well, I'm just going to lift and drop what's worked for me before into that environment, I would have had no time to think at Sainsbury's as somebody who loves having time to think. So I think also don't try and necessarily fight. I think sometimes I kind of try and fight my context. Actually try and kind of work within it and sort of recognize, okay, well, for example, when I was in a very busy corporate affairs function, of course there's firefighting. That is part of that job. Doing that job well means firefighting and troubleshooting. So time to think is going to look different. When I then moved into a strategy role, part of that job was the quality of my thinking. And so again, that looked and felt different, even in the same organization. Just a few quick hacks before I go on to something slightly different that I wanted to share, kind of going beyond the podcast. And feel free to head into chat because I know you will all have great ideas on this as well. So I think 3 common barriers that we have here on time to think, and what's a sort of short, simple hack in terms of what we might go from and to. So the first one, I don't have time to think. There just isn't enough time in the day to think. And that's where I think we need to challenge ourselves, maybe do a bit of a reframe from time to think means a long time, means taking a day. We did talk about this on the podcast, to actually, how do I think in short bursts? How can I quickly how can I do some quick thinking? You might even use that phrase. That might be a useful phrase. So even just to remind yourself, some quick thinking. Yesterday, I'm going to give you an example in a bit. Helen and I need to do some quick thinking about something. And it was probably 6 minutes, 7 minutes. Maybe this is what's happened from the skill sprint. We now only do things in 7-minute sprints. But sometimes, quick thinking can be really valuable. I think you can get further than you think quite quickly, that further than we often give ourselves credit for. So sometimes I think almost like trying that discipline of like, what does 5 minute of thinking time look like for you? What can you think about in 1 minute? What would thinking at the start of the day look like for 2 minutes before you maybe you're going to get pulled into the firefighting and the troubleshooting? So just moving from, I think sometimes we sort of put time to think on a pedestal. It reminds me a bit of busy, like, oh, we're all really busy and I never have time to think. And if I was being really tough on myself and really trying to hold myself to account, I would say, well, that feels almost too abstract, or maybe that I'm giving myself excuses. I'm always busy and I never have time to think. I'm sort of stuck on this hamster wheel. And I think when we really start to be a bit more forensic about this, you've got to do some reframing or some challenging of your own conventions. It's a bit of actually unlearning and relearning. What do we think time to think looks like? What is successful time to think? So moving to short bursts and quick thinking. Next one, overwhelm. Something feels really complex or complicated, slightly different things. But if they feel really complex, can't see the wood from the trees, I just don't know how to think this through. Maybe it just feels really messy. That's always the word I would use. This feels really messy. And my brain sort of goes, like, and sort of flashing bulb. And you can't make sense of it. So that ability, your time to think that you're looking for is to try and do some sense making, but it feels hard because everything feels messy. Maybe this feels like there's a lot that you could do or should be doing. This is where I really like, and this is stolen from Liz Wiseman, who did that great episode with me on high impact players. That book, by the way, is a very good book, particularly if you're in the corporate world. I would say if you're in the corporate world and you want roles with big influence and impact, it's one of the very few books where I think, yeah, do you know what? Everything I read, I feel like she got it really spot on. Really good mix of research and practical advice. And one of the things that Liz Wiseman talked to me about that's just stuck since our conversation, what's most important now? Asking yourself that question, what's most important now? And I think when things feel messy, this helps me get to clarity. So when we're going from complexity to clarity, or complicated to clarity, or messy to understanding, or messy to making progress, that would probably stick for me. How do I go from messy to making progress? I would ask myself, what's most important now? Or what do I need to think about first? So essentially, it's a prioritizing question. Next one, if you are very task orientated, this is less of a problem for me, to be honest, but if you are a real doer and you are all about ticking things off your to-do list, and that's what feels like winning for you, you sort of go, I sort of want to get through these tasks. Try a reframe that moves from outputs to outcomes. I think when we're in outputs could be, I sent 20 emails today. Outputs could be, I finished a presentation. It's an output. You did something. Outputs are usually visible. So I could see that thing. You could show me that thing. If we move from outputs to outcomes, I think we value thinking more. So outcomes would look like we found a new way of making our customers really happy. It's like an outcome. Our customers are happier now than they were 6 months ago. So there's loads of stuff that will have happened. There's loads of outputs that will have contributed to that, of course, but it's the outcome that you've got to. And sometimes just connecting to outcomes, they tend to be bigger, they tend to be longer term, and usually they need good quality thinking to achieve them. So outcomes rather than outputs. Obviously, you have to have outputs too, but if you are just trying to do a bit of rewiring and you struggle to see time to think as productive, that sort of what is the definition of productivity? Well, I think one of the things that we have to offer our organizations, how we add value, is really good quality thinking. And if we're always in output mode, I think we sort of miss a trick. So maybe think more about outcomes than outputs, at least some of the time, if you're trying to do a bit of unlearning and relearning. So a few kind of quick hacks there. These are all of reframes, I think. Oh yeah, Liz Wiseman's first book, Multiply, also really good. All about kind of talent and potential. So a few bits of reframes here. So I think you've got to do these reframes. And once we've got the reframes, that sort of sets us up a bit, I think, for successful thinking. And I was thinking about this. I was thinking, you end up saying thinking a lot. Also, I do a lot of thinking. I was reflecting on the different types of thinking we might do in a week. And I got to, sometimes we're doing thinking very much in the now. And maybe that's because you need to make a decision. Maybe you've been asked for your point of view, but there's a todayness or an immediacy about that thinking. Like, okay, that's interesting. That's one kind of thinking. And sometimes I think we might forget this one because we think, I need to think about where my career could take me. Or I need to think about the future of technology. We have these kind of really big thoughts, but we do a lot of thinking day to day. So sometimes it's just about spotting those things. And then we do thinking and reflecting that is more about the future, which is where we are more in exploring, and it will probably feel less concrete, and it usually feels longer term. And I think it's helpful to have a process for how are you going to approach thinking in the now, today, this week, versus thinking longer term. So sort of thinking now, thinking longer term. What is the process that works for you? What's your kind of go-to process? Remembering that point about, but we're going to be flexible enough about that process to figure out how well does that process work in where I am today. So if you've got to overlay, I think, this process with, and does that feel like it's got a good fit with my context, with my culture? So I'm going to describe these two and like what I would do in these examples, just to bring it to life, because my hope would be after today, you go away and kind of create your own process for time to think. Maybe you just have one. Maybe like me, you end up with two. You kind of do a now one and a future one, partly because I think I just got to different answers. I feel like it's a different thinking process for me, depending on whether it's a today or a future thing. So let's do a today thing. And I think for each of them, it's helpful to have a framework. So like a go-to framework that helps you to think something through, and some filters. So framework and filters. So my framework, my go-to framework for thinking something through in the moment, today, tomorrow, is always pretty much the 5 W's and the H. Super simple. Most of you will know this. Who, what, why, where, when, how. So let me give you an example from yesterday. Helen and I were discussing and we were sort of thinking about, what do we do about Squiggly Careers being trademarked? So Squiggly Careers is trademarked. We don't use that trademark, the little TM, you sometimes see like the little TM next to a logo. We don't use that trademark very often, if ever, but we've got the trademarks. Sometimes we see that Squiggly Careers gets used in a way where it's maybe people don't attribute it to us. People don't kind of make that connection. And we were thinking through, like, does that matter? Like, do we care? Does it matter? What's most important to us about Squiggly Careers? Is it that it gets attributed to us? Is it that it just gets shared and scaled? And do we just sort of let go of it? So this was the 7 minutes of thinking that I was describing to you yesterday. And it was prompted by a couple of things that Helen had seen, a couple of things that I'd seen. And so we were thinking about, do we, on our logo, start to put the thinking through, do we on our logo start to put the kind of TM? And so we went through this really fast. Okay, well, why would we do this? Why wouldn't we do this? What would it look like? How would we do it? Where would we do it? Who would we be doing it for? Just really, really, really simple, open questions. We were doing this on WhatsApp and we did it really, really fast. And sometimes we were disagreeing. I was like, oh, I think it's this. And Helen would be like, I think it's that. But very fast thinking something through. But rather than us both just sharing our, you could have been like, well, I feel a bit like this, or this is my gut instinct. Actually, we were both answering the same questions. So that gave us enough of a framework. And we might have different answers to those questions, but at least we were kind of asking and answering the same questions. I will tell you the outcome in a second. And then our filter is always, because this is, in this example, lots of my now thinking is obviously about amazing if and squiggly careers, I go back to, well, what's our mission and our goals? 2, what's our values? And 3, what are the outcomes that we're aiming for? So we do use outcomes. We have good growth guides in Amazing If, and we have very clear outcomes that we're trying to achieve. So you've got a framework for thinking, and then you've got a filter to sort of compare that thinking against. And when we got to then using the filter, because you go, right, okay, well, our mission is to make squiggly careers better for everyone. Okay, that's helpful. So the everyone there gives you a bit of a sense of, well, scale's important to us, accessibility is important to us. We don't want to be too protectionist about squiggly careers. What are our goals? We want to make squiggly synonymous with careers. We don't say we want to make squiggly synonymous with Sarah and Helen, or we want to make squiggly synonymous with Amazing If, or we want to everybody who says squiggly to then say Amazing If, so actually we say we want squiggly to be synonymous with careers. That's one of our goals. And then we want to be go-to global experts on career development. And that one might get you to some different answers. Then we've got values, useful, energy, action, work in progress, and we've got some outcomes. Within about 5 or 6 minutes, Helen and I then both got to the same immediate, we sort of thought things through, we had different thoughts, but then we both got to, do you know what? We don't want to be overly protective of squiggly careers. We've got it trademarked, and we think that's really important to have for ourselves. But if people share it and don't connect it to us, they're still making squiggly synonymous with careers. They're still getting it out into the world. And what we have seen is that often people will connect the dots for us. So our advocates, people like yourselves, will go on and say, oh, have you seen Sarah and Helen's TED Talk on squiggly careers? Oh, actually, have you heard their podcast? And so actually just having the confidence to let go of sometimes seeing squiggly careers and thinking, oh, okay, that feels like somebody's owning a concept there that we work very hard to create and scale and get out there. It helps you to kind of let go of your ego. Some of it is your ego talking. And also to understand, but is it commercially important for us? And we sort of got to, in our thinking yesterday, and that thinking might change, you'll know now, if that trademark thing pops up, you'll know we've changed our minds. But in our thinking yesterday, very quickly, we got to, do you know what? Leave it as it is. Leave it and live with it was essentially our conclusion. So very quick thinking based on a framework and a filter. So I always come back to those. I always use the 5 W's and the how. People in our team will know that because they're always the questions that I ask when I'm thinking something through. And I always use that as a filter as well. Slightly different one. When I'm thinking through future things, my framework, which we did talk about on the podcast, is to start with a to think list. So I always start with a to think list. We know about to-do lists. I think we should all have a to think list, like written down somewhere, not just in our heads. Actually, particularly if you are a thinker, don't keep it in your head. Like write it down, do a diagram, whatever it might be. And I think what's useful about a to think list is when you start to go, well, what's everything on my to think list, but what do I want to think about now? And these are bigger questions. So these could be, so my one at the moment is how will or how can AI help make careers better for everyone, help make squiggly careers better for everyone? Because I'm sort of pro tech. I think it can make our lives easier and better when it's used in the right way. And I really want to sort of spend time exploring. So this is like, I'm thinking about this and I want to sort of connect to it and learn and understand more and explore. But I'm not going to get to it's not the same as yesterday. I'm not getting to a decision or to a recommendation. I'm not trying to make specific progress, but I do want to think about it. And so it gives me focus. To think lists give you focus. Otherwise, my brain meanders and wanders in all sorts of different directions, which I also allow it to do some of the time. But there are moments where you're like, well, I want to be focused in those big things that I'm exploring. It could be, maybe you're feeling a bit uncertain about your career. So it could be a big zoomed out question about you personally. I want to get more clarity about where my career could take me over the next 3 or 4 years. I want to think about how I could use my strengths in different ways. So it can be an individual thing you want to think about. I want to improve my work-life fit, but I don't know what that looks like. If anybody else is in the sort of September relief of like your kids have gone back to school. So whatever it might be, or it could be more specific to kind of you and your job, like trends or themes or those kind of things. And then my filters, when I then think about these kind of bigger questions, longer term questions, are 1, the knowns and the unknowns. So what do I know already and what do I not know? I just find that a really helpful exercise. Sometimes you don't know anything. Most of the time you know something. Even if, like, I don't know very much about AI at all, but I know a bit. Like, we did a podcast episode a bit about AI and careers. I sort of dipped my toe, maybe half a foot, in that kind of water. I've read a little bit more about it. It's sort of unmissable at the moment. I follow some people in that area that are giving me a bit of a perspective and point of view. So what do you know? What don't you know? Then I do think here it's useful to think about, well, how do I think best? What really helps to further my thinking on these really big questions? And the reason that I say that is I really see the contrast between Helen and I here. I need a question and I need space to think about it for myself. And then I need to talk to other people. Helen thinks on the spot. In a way, actually, I've not really come across that many times. But her thinking is so much better on the spot than actually it is with time, which, as somebody who doesn't work in that way, I find sort of incredible to observe. But you are honestly better with Helen getting her in the room or on a Zoom and saying, what do you think about this? Whereas if I said to her, well, can we think about this question for a week and then can we come back? She's no further forward. How she progresses her thinking, she thinks out loud. You know that, do you think out loud or do you think sort of for yourself and then further your thinking with other people? I think for myself first and then I further my thinking with other people. Helen does the opposite. She thinks out loud to other people and then she goes off and furthers her thinking by herself. So we work in opposite ways. It is just worth you knowing that, because then you can sort of design your own development or curate your own curriculum, thinking about these topics in a way that's going to really help to accelerate your thinking and also just in a style or an approach that works for you. And then third, and I did try to get this screen shared this morning, but I couldn't get it onto my iPad for you. Talking about process, how are you going to organize your thoughts? So I am experimenting at the moment with using Miro boards more often. And that's working really well for me, because what I do is as I collect things, as I think that's interesting, on a board, it ends up being a place to put my thoughts. And I am messy generally and put lots of things in lots of different places. And I'm not trying to force that to change. So I sort of accept that that is my way of working. But what I do find is that sometimes my thoughts get lost, or I think it's helpful to visualize your thoughts. So I like a Miro board, and you can do, it's basically just Post-it notes. But I just find, even yesterday, I was reading something and I was like, oh, I want to keep that because I think we'll come back to it. And so I've saved it in one of my Miro boards, and I've got a little Post-it note that says research, and it was just a link. So it's just somewhere to put your thoughts. Again, it just helps you, I think, to know you're making progress. Miro boards, good notes, sort of whatever works for you, but don't force something that doesn't feel right for you. Using Notion, Miro is free. Josie, I think you get 3 boards for free. So most of them you've got. Caroline, you like Trello. When I've used Trello, it's been more for projects, but I honestly don't think it matters. Just experiment with whatever works for you, but try not to keep all of your thoughts in your head. I think we miss out on creating connections when we do that. And at some point, it is helpful to kind of keep things together. 3 coach yourself questions to finish with for today. A when question to start with. I really like a when coach yourself question. I don't think we ask enough when questions of ourselves. So when do I do my best thinking? You will already do some good thinking. So like, when does that happen? Then what's one change that you could make that you sort of, your hypothesis is that it would improve your thinking if you made that change? Last one, how? How will you know if you've succeeded? What you don't want to be doing is in 6 months' time thinking, I found that How to Think episode really interesting. I enjoyed the PodPlus, but nothing's changed. I still feel like I don't have time to think. So what is it that you're going to do differently? Is it the reframe around time? Is it a tool or a technique that you heard on the podcast? Is it frameworks and filters. Does that work for you? That just clearly works for me. We didn't talk about that in the podcast, but I was thinking, oh, how do we add some extra value this morning? And I was genuinely trying to deconstruct what works for me. So steal the bits that work, ignore and edit out the bits that don't, and just start trying things out. But I don't want any of us, certainly in our PodPlus community, to be feeling like we never have time to think. Of course, there'll be good days and bad days. But I really hope that has felt useful for you this morning. If you're new to PodPlus, thank you so much for joining. There's only been me this morning, so I've not really been able to keep up with the chat, but I know you will have all talked to each other a lot. So thank you all for doing that. And what are we doing the podcast on next week? Judgment. Really interesting topic. So yeah, how to sort of improve your judgment. What does judgment mean in the context of work and careers? So see you next week for that. I think it'll be Helen next week because I'm off to Geneva, which is very exciting and not quite as glamorous as it sounds. Thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.